Good evening, everybody, and welcome into tonight's program with the Schaumburg Library. My name is Chris. I'm the Adult Programs Coordinator here at the library, and I am so excited to be spending this evening with you guys as we kick off a brand new lecture series for the library, Night with the Museum. Night with the Museum will take place on the third Tuesday of the month. Um, on the third Tuesday of the month from 7 to 8 p.m. And it's specifically, with one small exception, going to be featuring museums, cultural institutions from outside of the state of Illinois. We want to give you guys opportunities to explore these wonderful institutions that our country has to offer that you don't have the easy ability to get in a car and drive to. And tonight we are so excited to be joined by the Charles Lindbergh House and Museum up in Minnesota. And we have an amazing speaker tonight. You can see her up there in your screen, Lacey Fontaine. Before I formally introduce Lacey, though, I got to do what I always do and give you your friendly Zoom reminders. The first thing is make sure you have a blanket on your lap. That's different this time because it is freezing outside. So I want to make sure you guys are staying warm and comfortable and safe in this horrible, horrible weather. But then also note that closed captions have been turned on for your convenience. If you have any questions at all during tonight's presentation, please make sure you're using the Q&A box to submit those questions. We're going to collect all questions as we go throughout the program, and we'll address them at the end of the presentation. And then if you're having any technical difficulties during the program, also make sure you're using the Q&A to reach out to me so that I can help you with any of those difficulties you might be having. I'm going to go off camera here in a little bit, but don't worry, I'm still around in case anything bad happens. So without any further ado, let me pull up my little thing to read from here. And let me introduce Lacey. Lacey Fontaine joined the Minnesota Historical Society in the summer of 2021 at the Charles Lindbergh House and Museum as a program assistant. Lacey is a graduate student at St. Cloud State University, where she studies the historiography of white supremacist movements and how they impact the United States today. Everyone, please join me in giving Lacey a warm virtual Schaumburg Library welcome.
All right, thank you so much for that introduction, Chris. I'm very excited to be doing this presentation titled Lindbergh and America First, and I'm even more excited that we get to kick off the Night with the Museum series. We are located here in Little Falls, Minnesota, which is about a 2.5-hour drive north from the Twin Cities. So yeah, let's get started. So we're going to begin this presentation by talking a little bit about who Charles Lindbergh was. He was the first man to fly across the Atlantic solo and nonstop. He did this on May 20th and 21st of 1927. After his flight, he became an instant celebrity and a household name. Today's presentation, however, is focused on the complicated legacy of Charles Lindbergh. We will begin this by discussing historical presentism. So what is it and how does it apply to Charles Lindbergh? Historical presentism poses the question, should we judge historical figures by today's moral standards? We will discuss this more a little bit later on in the presentation, but we'll start a little bit with Charles's childhood. So Charles was born in Detroit, Michigan in 1902. His mother, Evangeline, was a recent college graduate and a chemistry teacher at the Little Falls High School. His father, Charles August Lindbergh, or C.A. Lindbergh, as his friends would call him, was a prominent Minnesota politician and lawyer. When World War I broke out in 1914, C.A. Lindbergh was vocally opposed to the United States going to war. He argued that only the bankers and other wealth grabbers would benefit from war with Germany. In 1917, he published Why Your Country is at War, a book which he blamed the inner circle of the wealthiest for pushing the nation into conflict. His anti-war writings and speeches during World War I caused him to be branded as a traitor and affected the outcome of the 1918 governor election in Minnesota. At the time, Lindbergh was prevented from speaking in many parts of the state, and he was opposed by many powerful public opinion-forming agencies. C.A. ran for a seat in the United States Senate in 1960 and ran as a Republican candidate for governor of Minnesota. Both attempts were unsuccessful. In 1924, C.A. ran again but died shortly after. CA wrote adamantly against the enfranchisement of African Americans and believed that African Americans by nature were, quote, inferior to the white race. In his opinion, it had been a mistake to allow African Americans the right to vote. CA believed that there should be a separate state for African American population where they might exercise national character and, quote, rapidly improve a higher morality. Lastly, CA believed that interracial marriage would not elevate the white race, but it would eventually, quote, eventually lift the black. CA's beliefs would have influenced his young son Charles throughout his life, from his involvement in the America First Committee as an isolationist and his problematic beliefs in eugenics and replacement theory. Charles Lindbergh's mother, Evangeline Lodge Land, also harbored negative opinions towards Jewish people. Ava Lindbergh, Charles's half-sister, documented times where she was not allowed to play with certain children if they were Jewish when the family resided in Minneapolis. Charles would be influenced by his parents' beliefs, but also would be influenced by his friendships a little later in life. Notably, in 1935, Charles became friends with a prominent scientist by the name of Dr. Alexis Carrel. Carrel was considered the father of transplant. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1912. Carrel was born in France and came to the United States to work at the Rockefeller Institute to research organ transplantation. In the 1930s, Dr. Carrel met Charles Lindbergh to develop a pump that would allow organs to thrive and oxygenate outside of the body. The men would experiment on a cat and kept the cat's thyroid alive for 30 days and its heart going for 12 hours. Dr. Alexis Carrel was also known for his belief in eugenics. Carrel wrote extensively about the condition of man in his book, Man the Unknown. In his book, he advocates for the, quote, euthanization of criminals through the use of gases. Carrel's book also promotes the idea of selective breeding to promote the strong. Carrel believed that the only way to, quote, obviate the disastrous predominance of the weak was to develop the strong. His views dovetailed with his work at the Rockefeller Foundation, which until 1939 funded research used to support Nazi racial ideologies. Carrel retired from the Rockefeller Institute in 1938, where he conducted eugenics research. However, this would not be the end of his research. In 1941, he accepted a grant from Nazi-occupied Vichy France to set up an institute in Paris where he could continue to examine the problems of man. After the liberation of France, Carrel was considered to have collaborated with the Nazis and would likely have been brought to trial if he had not died in 1944. Lindbergh said that he considered Carrel to have, quote, a most stimulating mind, and his time with Carrel to be the most thrilling intellectual adventure of his life. Carrel's study of eugenics reflected in the writings of Lindbergh, particularly in his publication titled Aviation, Geography, and Race in 1939. This article was featured in the Reader's Digest. In this article, Lindbergh laid out a worldview based on the domination of the white race. In Lindbergh's view, France, England, Nazi Germany, and the United States represent a, quote, Western wall of race and arms against foreign races, quote, Oriental guns, and the infiltration of inferior blood. According to historian Dr. Lloyd Gardner, his desire to spread his healthy genes and belief in eugenics led to his secret affairs with 3 German women that produced 7 children. As Europe crept toward war, the United States was determined to remain neutral. Still, the US military asked Lindbergh to go to Germany to assess the German Luftwaffe. Charles made 4 trips to Germany and even attended the Berlin Olympics in 1936. While his trips produced intel for the United States, the Germans took full advantage of the aviators' presence. They showboated the aviation achievements of the German nation. Lindbergh developed a deep appreciation for Hitler in Germany. In a letter written to Harry Davidson in 1937, Lindbergh said Hitler was, quote, an undoubtedly great man, and believed that Hitler has done much good for the German people. In October 1938, while on a visit to Germany, Lindbergh received the Service Cross of the Order of the German Eagle at the direction of Adolf Hitler. Lindbergh treated the medal like any other he had received. He never wore it, but he also declined to return it despite public backlash. In 1941, Lindbergh donated his medal to a museum in St. Louis, where it is currently in their collections. Less than a month after the presenting of the medal, the Nazis orchestrated a brutal assault on Jews that came to be known as Kristallnacht, or Night of the Broken Glass. Nazis and their sympathizers smashed the windows of Jewish businesses, burned homes and synagogues, and left scores dead. Between 20,000 and 30,000 Jews were arrested and sent to concentration camps. The Lindberghs had wanted to make Berlin their permanent residence. However, Charles stated, quote, "I do not wish to cause embarrassment to our government or to the German government." The Lindberghs decided to cancel their plans to move to Germany and instead resided in France until 1938. In 1940, a group of Yale University students founded the America First Committee to oppose U.S. intervention in the European War. They quickly mobilized hundreds of other anti-war students to join the organization and persuaded one of the nation's most outspoken isolationists. Lindbergh's enormous celebrity helped the America First Committee become a national organization with as many as 800,000 members. As early as 1934, the Roosevelt administration began compiling a list of American right-wingers and Nazi sympathizers. By September of 1939, Lindbergh joined the FBI's watch list. From September 1939 to April of 1941, FBI informants attended his speeches and monitored his activities with the America First Committee. At these speeches, the informants would track notable celebrities in attendance, the amount of money raised, and the size and demographics of the crowd. Along with monitoring Lindbergh's speeches, the FBI also kept a watchful eye on the American press for articles about Lindbergh. On September 11th, 1941, Charles made a speech in Des Moines, Iowa, that would forever change his image. Speaking at an America First assembly, Lindbergh asserted that there are three groups responsible for pressuring the U.S. into World War II, these so-called, quote, war agitators. These three groups were the British, the Roosevelt administration, and the Jews. Overlooking the unprovoked German invasion of Poland, Lindbergh blamed England for starting the war. He asserted that England was not large enough or strong enough to win the war. He said, quote, "If England can draw this country into the war, she can shift to our shoulders a large portion of the responsibility for waging it and paying the cost." Lindbergh then went on to say that even if America entered the war, it is not possible for Allied armies to invade Europe and overwhelm the Axis powers. Lastly, Lindbergh stated that England had spent large amounts of money on propaganda in America during the present war. Lindbergh also accused the Roosevelt administration of using dictatorial procedures to obtain a third presidential term and add billions of dollars of debt. Lindbergh stated, quote, "The danger of the Roosevelt administration lies in its subterfuge. While its members have promised us peace, they have led us to war, heedless of the platform upon which they were elected." Most notoriously, Lindbergh accused the Jews of pushing the United States toward war. Lindbergh stated that it was not difficult to understand why the Jews wanted to overthrow Nazi Germany, given Nazi persecution. Lindbergh stated that he believed that the Jews pose a danger to this country because of their large ownership and influence in, quote, "motion pictures, our press, our radio, and our government." Lindbergh also stated, quote, "We cannot allow the natural passions and prejudices of other people lead our country to destruction." Jewish communities around the country immediately responded to Lindbergh's accusations. The American Jewish Committee and the Jewish Labor Committee denounced Lindbergh by declaring the speech low and baseless. Furthermore, the Jewish people rejected his un-American appeal to selfish interest. The American Jewish Congress issued a statement stating that, quote, "American Jews will neither be bribed or blackmailed into renouncing their just and equal status as citizens of the United States." Other prominent people were quick to denounce Lindbergh's speech as well. Famed children's author Theodore Geisel, otherwise known as Dr. Seuss, wrote political cartoons during the wartime era. Dr. Seuss targeted Lindbergh in numerous political cartoons that accused the aviator of being a puppet of the Third Reich. Lindbergh's private feelings mirrored his anti-Jewish public statements. In his wartime journals, Lindbergh wrote unfavorably of Jewish people in many entries. Portions of these journals were redacted by Lindbergh for publication. However, the uncensored journals are available to researchers consulting the Lindbergh papers at Yale University. After the violence of Kristallnacht, Lindbergh expressed frustration with Germany, stating, quote, My admiration of the Germans is constantly being dashed against some rocks such as this. At the same time, Lindbergh blamed Jews for the violence they endured. Lindbergh stated, quote, Jewish pressure on Germany combined with an inherent German hatred of the Jews led Germany to persecute them. The America First Committee collapsed after the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor. When Lindbergh wished to re-enlist in the United States Air Force, he was met with adamant rejection from the Roosevelt administration, still questioning where Lindbergh's loyalty was. Lindbergh went to work for Henry Ford at the Willow Run bomber plant, where he conducted aerospace design and test flights. He later flew 50 combat missions as a civilian advisor in the South Pacific. Still, Lindbergh never wavered from his view that American participation in World War II was a mistake. Reflecting back in 1969, he wrote, quote, we won the war in a military sense, but in a broader sense, it seems to me we lost it. Much of our Western culture was destroyed. We lost the genetic hereditary formed through eons. Charles Lindbergh's speeches attracted a lot of attention from white supremacists and pro-Nazi groups before World War II. One of the most prominent was Father Charles Coughlin. Coughlin was a Roman Catholic priest whose radio programs attracted an estimated 30 million listeners. Although he did not start out as an anti-Semitic broadcaster, by the late 1930s, he was speaking out in support of the Nazis and blaming the Jews for a host of political and economic troubles, even promoting the debunked conspiracy theory that predicted world domination by the Jews. Charles Coughlin distributed a magazine called Social Justice. In 1940, the magazine featured Lindbergh's face in excerpts from his speeches, while Coughlin boasted that Lindbergh was a true American patriot who could be the next president of the United States. The second group to use Lindbergh's image was the Silver Shirts, another white supremacist organization that thought Nazism could translate into American politics. Founded by William Dudley Pelley, the Silver Shirts, which boasted around 15,000 members, dreamed of a white utopia that excluded non-whites and Jews. Pelley wrote a letter to General George Van Horn Moseley in April of 1941, stating that he believed Lindbergh would serve in one of the highest positions if American Nazism was achieved, providing, quote, glamour to assure the interest of the public. Interestingly, Lindbergh was called to the sedition trial of William Dudley Pelley as a defense witness. Lindbergh took the stand, but neither defended nor condemned the actions of Pelley. Instead, Lindbergh took the stand and told prosecutors that there were a lot of people against the United States joining the war. Historians continue to investigate the connections between Lindbergh and Pelley, and there is no clear answer as to why Pelley wanted Lindbergh to testify on his behalf. The last group to lionize Lindbergh was the German-American Bund. It was the largest pro-Nazi organization in the US, tallying about 30,000 members at one point. The group supported the Nazi regime and practiced its own version of American Nazism, including fielding paramilitary units armed with clubs and costuming its members in uniforms and swastika armbands. It was large enough to run several summer camps for American Nazi youth and even sent its best and brightest to Germany for indoctrination. The Bundist publication, Free American, urged its readers to become members of the America First Committee. After Lindbergh's speech in September of 1941, other events by the America First Committee began to attract Coughlinites, Bundists, and the Silver Shirts. Historian Wayne Cole wrote that, quote, many anti-Semites within America First ranks and on its fringes interpreted the address as an invitation to use the committee as a vehicle for spreading their anti-Semitic ideas. After the Des Moines speech, America First rallies became littered with Nazi symbols and propaganda. Nazi German propaganda commended the America First Committee and called it, quote, true Americanism and true patriotism. Organizations such as the America Bund movement, the Silver Shirts, and the Coughlinites collapsed after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. Despite the collapse of these organizations, American Nazism persisted. Nazis attempted to march and rally in Skokie, Illinois in 1978, and today some in the alt-right have taken up the mantle of white supremacy and Nazism in the United States. The anti-Semitic Unite the Right rally in March in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017, and more recently the presence of Camp Auschwitz and 6MWE, 6 million wasn't enough, t-shirts at the siege of the US Capitol in January 2021 shows the strains of Nazism and anti-Semitism are alive and well in the United States in the 21st century. White supremacists today continue to exploit Lindbergh's image and views, notably the American Freedom Party, formerly known as the America Third position, is led by a group of white nationalists. A3P uses Lindbergh's image and echoes Lindbergh's words to promote white supremacist ideas to their members. A3P promotes Lindbergh's ideology from his article in Reader's Digest, Aviation, Geography, and Race, warning of the infiltration of inferior blood and the necessary preservation of the white race. It is important for us to remember Charles Lindbergh's breathtaking solo flight in 1927, his technological genius, his civilian service in World War II, his concern for the environment, and his personal family tragedies. But we should also recognize the impact of his words and actions on the United States, for better and for worse, both during his life and today. Lindbergh's legacy is problematic. His beliefs in eugenics and anti-Semitic sentiments are two critical issues that have not disappeared from American society. In 2021, Jewish communities in the United States were the most targeted religious group. The Anti-Defamation League recorded 3,697 incidents of anti-Semitism in the United States, a 36% increase from 2021. This is the highest number on record since the ADL began tracking anti-Semitic incidents in 1979. The idea of eugenics is an old idea with a violent history. Eugenicists sought to improve the human population and its gene pool through encouraging fit individuals to procreate and discouraging or preventing the reproduction of unfit. This led to forced sterilization of thousands of Americans, and in the case of Nazi Germany, the justification for murdering millions of people. 20th century eugenics is still prominent in American society today. Between 1973 and 1976, the United States government authorized the sterilization of 3,406 Native American women without their consent. More recently, the United States executed the forced sterilization of women at ICE detention centers at the border between US and Mexico. Lastly, eugenics ideals have impacted the COVID-19 pandemic. During the pandemic, we placed different values on people's lives using oppressive definitions of quality and treat people differently based on their health status. Examples include placing a lower value of life because a person is older, disabled, or overweight. As historians, we talk about historical presentism and judge the actions of the past by the moral standards of today, because we rely on the past as a comparative guidepost to values we wish to hold in the present. It is important to note that those who say we shouldn't judge people in the past by the moral standards of today often overlook the reality that there has now or ever been a unified moral standard of the past, not today and not in Lindbergh's lifetime. Americans in the 1930s held widely different opinions about the treatment of Jews, and many people were horrified by Lindbergh's views even then. The condemnation of Lindbergh by Harold Ickes, Dr. Seuss, Franklin Roosevelt, and the public suggests that his racism was no more acceptable than it is today. Furthermore, the public condemnation of Lindbergh by Jewish organizations reveals that anti-Semitism was still very prominent in American society, despite the widely publicized atrocities that Nazis were committing against the Jews. If this presentation suggests anything, it's that moral standards of the past, whether good or bad, are not really in the past. So that is the end of the presentation. If you enjoyed our presentation and want to know a little bit more about Lindbergh's life, we do have other digital programs that are located on the Minnesota Historical Society website. So make sure you check those now, or check those out. And we can move to questions.
Awesome. Lacey, thank you so much. This is the second time I've worked with you. For those of you wondering, Lacey's standing right there.
Okay.
You, as always, are, and Lacey went away. I'm assuming they're doing something technical. So while they do something technical, Lacey, I'm assuming you can hear me. I will ask one of our guest questions. Remember, guys, you can throw questions into the Q&A box, and Lacey will answer them for you. Any questions at all? Don't be shy. One of our guests would like to know, when did the Lindbergh family move from Detroit, Michigan to Minnesota?
So it would have been about 6 weeks after Lindbergh was born. So he lived in Little Falls from 1902 until about 1920.
Thanks.
Mhm.
I'm gonna ask. You might have talked about this during the presentation, and I might have missed it because I one point went up to refresh my water. Lindbergh was eventually kind of disassociated, like the America First campaign eventually was like, no, not that, and like disassociated and like kicked him off of the committee, correct?
Yeah, so after he made his speech in September of 1941, the America First committee sat him down and was like, yeah, no, this is not this is not what we're going to do. They did disassociate with Lindbergh after that. Lindbergh would still speak for a few months after, and then Pearl Harbor happened, and the whole movement fell apart after that. So it wasn't right away they disassociated with him. It was a few months, so he did a few more speaking engagements. But then Pearl Harbor happened, and everything changed. And Lindbergh felt a sense of duty to serve the country, to help out with the war effort. But both Harold Ikes and Roosevelt felt that they didn't know where his allegiance was, so they didn't want him to go to war.
Question from the public. Was the kidnapping of his son felt to be related to his political views?
That's a really challenging question to answer because I think a lot of people believe that Lindbergh was involved with the kidnapping of his child, and that was because of his belief in eugenics. So his son was thought to have rickets disease, which is a disease that affects your development. And a lot of people at the time would try to hide their children from the public. And since Lindbergh was a very public figure, I think a lot of people feel that he probably orchestrated the kidnapping to keep his son away from the public. I have to just reiterate that this is just a theory. There's no evidence to suggest this happened, not that we know of anyway. But yes, it is a very popular theory that comes with the kidnapping.
Because for our home audience, last time I worked with Lacey, she had actually done her program about the kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby. So if you have the opportunity to see a digital
Yep.
rendition of that program, I highly recommend it. It is a very fascinating program. And Lacey does go over all the different theories of what happened to the Lindbergh baby. And it was all the way to the weird ones, some of like the wildest ones that I'd never even heard of. And that was probably one of the most fascinating afternoons I spent with an individual, was going over things I'd never heard existed. Couple more questions. Oh, they're starting to pour in. Did Lindbergh ever meet Henry Ford?
Yes, Lindbergh had a very close friendship with Henry Ford. He worked for Henry Ford in World War II, and then Lindbergh actually took Henry Ford on his first flight. So they knew each other since Charles became famous in 1927, and they remained friends until Henry Ford's death.
Any idea of why Charles's father held his anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic beliefs?
It's hard to know. We have some primary documentation with CA. He wrote a few books, and when I referenced that in the presentation, it actually came from an interview that he did with a local paper here in town. So he never wrote about them in his own books, but when he was interviewed, then he became more vocal about his opposition to giving the right to vote to African Americans.
Do we know if his wife, this is just me spinning off of that, did his wife share any of his views? Because she outlived him, correct?
Oh, by a lot, yes.
So did she
Are
like
you talking
ever
about
like
Anne? Are you talking about Anne Charles's wife? Or are you talking about Charles's mother?
Charles's wife? Because I know you had
Okay.
mentioned Charles's mother was anti-Semitic.
Yes. So Anne Morrow Lindbergh, during the 1930s, wrote a book called Wave of the Future. And in there, she referenced that fascism was the future. She was very influenced by Nazi Germany when they visited. She appreciated all of the nationalism that was happening there. It is important to note that Anne Morrow Lindbergh, a little bit later in her life, said that was the wrong thing to say. She apologized for those beliefs in writing that book. Charles Lindbergh never publicly apologized for his remarks, and Anne tried to apologize on his behalf after he was already gone, but yeah.
Was there evidence that Lindbergh had shifted his views on that as he grew older? Or is the
No.
only evidence Anne going, He was sorry, I promise.
Yeah, that was basically that. It was Anne Morrow saying he was, and his children too. Reeve Lindbergh, his daughter, has said that publicly too, that those statements that he said were not Charles. That's not how he raised us to be. Yet Charles never addressed the public backlash that he received from his public speeches. He wrote Autobiography of Values much later in his life, where he really kind of came down on his eugenics belief. He talked about, finding a wife that was, had good genes and that they could produce all of these children and they would have good genes. And so personally, just kind of researching Lindbergh's life the last 3 years, I don't think he ever really wavered from his beliefs.
Um, can we access the digital programs through the House website?
Yes. So there is a tab that says Learn More, or Learn on it. And if you go hit the down button on that, you'll be able to see our digital suite, and all of the videos are there.
This is a Henry Ford question, but perhaps you know the answer. Ford switched to war manufacturing instead of cars, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep.
Do we know, I mean, we kind of talked about it, but Charles's mother, how did she feel about his beliefs? Obviously, she aligned with them.
Yeah, I don't really know how Evangeline, I've never come across any documentation about how Evangeline felt after her son, made these very public speeches. We do know from early in Charles's life that Evangeline also harbored some anti-Semitic beliefs. I don't know if she would have disagreed with him. She died in the 50s, so there's really no documentation about how she felt about her son being in this very public light after World War II or during World War II.
Are any of his children still living, and did they share his views?
I can't speak for the children. I know 3 of them are, he has 7 children in Germany that I believe are all still alive. And then he has 3 children from his wife, Anne, that are still living. Reeve Lindbergh, Land Lindbergh, and Scott Lindbergh. They are all still alive. The only one who's really public is Reeve Lindbergh. She's published many books. She did a podcast with Eric Lindbergh, who is Charles's grandson, a year or so ago. So she talks about her father's beliefs pretty openly. I can't really speak for her and say that she shares those beliefs. That would be a question for her, but from what I've seen from her publications, I wouldn't say so, I guess. She felt very sad that her father said those things publicly. So, and then she talks about finding out that she has 7 German siblings and the effect that has on her as well. So you can find, if you want to learn more about Reeve Lindbergh, you can find her books. I think probably every major library would have them, or online store.
That's a great plug for your friendly library like us. And if we don't have them, we can always see if we can get them through lending, that another library can lend it to us for you. So if you ever, since we're talking about this, Lacey, are there books that you would recommend our patrons? And if you actually wouldn't mind, you should be able to just pull up the chat function and you can type in some books that they could potentially see if we have, or any book that they could go to for more information about Charles Lindbergh. They're interested in learning a little bit more about this American historical figure.
Yeah. I'm trying to find where I can type an answer in here.
If you just go to the next to Q&A, there's a little button that says chat, and you can click on that.
Oh, perfect.
And then just make sure it says that you're sending it to all attendees and not just to me, because it sometimes auto makes it like it says to, and there's a drop down you can hit to everyone. That way everyone can have access to any of this.
Awesome. I will type in some book recommendations there. Since Lindbergh is a pretty big historical figure, and he's one that is very has a very big global presence. There has been a lot of work done around Lindbergh's life. If you're looking for kind of an overview of his entire life, Scott Berg's Lindbergh biography is a very good one to start with. it goes into a lot of detail. Probably the one, if you want more specific into Charles's beliefs, there was a book published a couple of years ago by a Minnesota native, and the book is called, I'm blanking on the name now. Yes, Chris Gares. It's about Lindbergh's spiritual beliefs. Oh, it's a religious biography of Charles Lindbergh. So if you want to get more into what Lindbergh believed, that is a really, really good one. Because he was a very unique person. He had a lot of different beliefs.
I think for me, the first time I ever met you, and you told me all these things, I pretty much knew Lindbergh as a brief footnote in my history studies of, oh, by the way, this guy flew over to Paris, and that was it. That's all we talked about. We moved on, as this big moment in like technology, or machinery. And then honestly, never thought about him again. Until I was working in a museum that had some small artifacts, my last job before I was with you guys here at the library. And then met you and just learned all these absolutely wild and weird things. And in some case, and the anti-Semitic things, which never, like, I was like, wow, really? This guy, like, I just thought he flew a plane, and to know that he did so many other things, and was wild to me.
Yeah.
And then especially like all the weird theories with the kidnapping of his child. Could you also in there throw the link to your website so people can find the other digital lectures?
Yes. Give me just a minute.
No, of course. While you do that, I hope you can pat your head and rub your stomach at the same time. What do we know about the additional families Charles had? Can you go a little to that? Because that's something you talked to me a little bit about, and it is genuinely, this is a great question because this is fascinating stuff.
Yeah, so Charles, 7 children between 3 different German women. They were born between the 50s and 60s, so this would have been a little bit later in Lindbergh's life. 3 of them have come out publicly and were confirmed his children by DNA testing. They wrote a book. If you can read German, you're in a good place to read this book because it hasn't been translated to English yet. Hopefully one day it will. But those are the only 3 that have come out publicly. The others were DNA tested and proven to be his children as well. But we don't know much about them. They led their, lives and childhood thinking that this, was an ordinary man because he went by a alias. His alias name was Carew Kent. So they had no idea that their father was Charles Lindbergh until they found letters between their mother and Charles, and then they were able to connect the dots. They came out publicly in 2001, I believe. Charles wrote each of his mistresses after or before his death, asking them to not come public with this until Anne Morrow died. She died in 2001. So it was shortly after that these children came out publicly. So we don't know much about them, and they have chosen to remain kind of anonymous. I don't know if they do any work or do lectures or anything about their father. The one of the children has visited our museum before. That was many years ago. And she was, from what I gather, was a very interesting woman and wanted to know all about him. So that's all we know, really.
Do you know if Anne knew about his illegitimate children?
I think that Anne had an inkling that he was having an affair. I don't think that Anne knew about the children. Their marriage was a very complicated one. It was a very tough marriage on Anne Morrow. She also had an affair later in life as well. But I don't think Anne knew anything, or at least the severity of his affairs, if that makes sense.
For sure. One of our guests is, oh, I'm not going to say this right. I don't speak German, but Mit dir Fallich, is that the name of the book?
I believe it
MIT.
is. Yes.
Cool. I
Yep.
was like, I sure tried.
Yep.
And then who is Inca Lindbergh? Is that one of his illegitimate?
I don't know. Is that okay? Yes. Okay. That is one of his that is one of his children. I had to confirm. The three public ones are Astrid and then her two brothers, David and blanking on his name too. David and Astrid. That's all I got.
If we have a few more minutes with Lacey before we have to relinquish her into her tundra, her personal winter tundra. So please
Yeah.
feel free, if you have any more questions, throw them in. Lacey, I'm gonna ask a weird one. I know I don't
Yeah.
want to necessarily like glorify someone who had some things that we in today's age would are very much like, oh, not okay, don't say.
Mhm.
What is the weirdest thing you know about Lindbergh? Like the most wild, he would only eat hot dogs if he's wearing Red Sox. Like the most wild, out of this world, wacky fact that you're like, really?
Oh, I have one in my mind, but I'm not going to publicly share it. Um, and that one is just it's just wild. But there is I have, you know, most of our programming here, we have a lot of really niche facts about Lindbergh. I do think one of the most interesting stories that I've ever heard about Lindbergh is actually about the way he parents his children. He was said to be a very cold parent. He would leave, Charlie Jr. in a wire cage outside of his home for hours by himself. And that was just he explained it as his parenting technique. But one story, this was shortly before his child was kidnapped, was that he took the baby from the nursery and hid it in a closet. And then he went back to his study as if nothing happened. And the child's nurse, Betty Gow, and Anne Lindbergh were looking all over for this child and panicking. And like, I mean, I'm a mother, so I can't imagine losing a child, but he pulled this prank on them. And then while his wife and the nurse were so upset with him, he just laughed at them. So it's a very, it's interesting.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Wow. We did have a guest write in. One
Mhm.
person said, thank you for a wonderful presentation.
Yeah.
This is just promoting the journals of Anne Morrow Lindbergh, and that they're very well written and interesting, covering their courtship, plane travels around the world, their family life, and Lindbergh's work with America First. And you're
Yeah.
nodding, so obviously you agree with this patron. So
Yeah.
sounds like another great place for you all to go. If
Hmm.
you have any more information you'd like to get. And then one big thing, oh, here we go. Was a psychological analysis ever professionally performed about Charles Lindbergh?
There have been assumptions about any kind of mental condition that Lindbergh might have had, but he never had psychological testing, at least that I have seen
Mhm.
or come across in his life. I think he probably didn't think he needed it. He was friends with a lot of psychologists, a lot of very famous ones. Um, but I don't think he would ever subject himself to that willingly.
Gotcha. And well, do you know if would anyone have ever gone back and gone over like his documents and his letters to kind of try and piece together how did this brain work?
I guess I don't really know the answer to that. I don't know if anybody's ever come out with a study being like, this is why Lindbergh was the way he was. He's been dead for quite a few years now, and
Mhm.
people have written quite a bit about him since then, but I've never come across any kind of psychoanalysis on him.
Do you find that as time goes on, the things that are written about him are more full scope picture versus like kind of how I was like, all I knew is that he flew a plane. Like that's the only thing I know about this person. And I feel like that is very true. But I feel like as we grow, like if we're 2024, I have learned this whole new thing about this person. Um, do you find that like older publications about him are like, look at this American hero in his plane, and then
Yeah.
more people are like, well, there's a lot about this person in his plane. Let's look at the full picture of it.
Yeah. I think that, like I talked to you a little bit earlier, I think a lot of people view him with these rose colored glasses sometimes because what he has done in his life is extraordinary. It's nothing short of extraordinary. He was a farm boy from Minnesota that went on to make the first transatlantic flight solo nonstop. Um, And then he was the first modern celebrity, or as we see it today. So it's really hard. It's really hard to take that and, somebody who's read about Lindbergh and, criticize that, that he's very important. But I think it's important to note that we can both admire what he has done while criticizing the very harmful legacy he left behind. And that's with any historical figure that we come across. Lindbergh is someone who is very interesting to read about. I think authors in general have done a lot better of telling his more complete story. But yeah, I think it's better. So the Scott Berg, when he wrote the Lindbergh biography, didn't know about the German families. This one was done in the late 90s. Despite that, he does do a very good job of being very objective with Lindbergh and how he treats him in his book. So, and I think Chris Gares does an even better job in the religious biography of, and that's with the knowledge of the German families. So,
was there any question from a patron? Was there any family history of mental illness in his family lineage?
It's been speculated. So Charles's mother was she was a very interesting person as well. She was both verbally and physically assaulting her stepdaughters. She was very cruel at points. It's been speculated that she had some type of bipolar disorder. Again, we can't really confirm that. Nobody's taken the time to go and do a historical analysis on either Charles or his mother. But from the oral histories that we've read with Charles's half-sister, Ava Lindbergh, that she was a very troubled woman. Stories of, hitting. She pointed a gun at CA at one point during an altercation. She threatened to commit suicide in front of the children. So she was a very, very sick individual. But officially, it's really hard to answer that without somebody going back and doing that historical analysis of her. So.
And based off of what you said about Charles and his, I don't want a psychologist analyzing me, I would bet that that's something that is parent downward, and his parents probably are very similar in that regard. So there wouldn't be an analysis on her.
Right.
And I think with a lot of historical, especially parents, you can see like when we look at my best example from my time in museum work is, the wealthy matriarch of this family who seems so cold and hating of her children. But one of our patrons had pointed out in the Q&A, just as a side comment, that, we're looking at things with hindsight and seeing things in a different lens than they probably would have back then. And things that we are appalled by, like hiding a baby to freak out your wife, might not have really been that troubling to as many people in the population as it is today. And, her behavior back then to us now is like, whoa, that's wild. But back then they're probably like, sounds like someone just needs to have a little lie down on their fainting couch. Like I think that's so interesting to speculate how some people would have viewed that behavior back then versus how we do in this day and age. We're getting close on our time, so I want to make sure I have one important question that I always love to ask our presenters, and sometimes it makes total sense, and other times they're like, why have you asked me this? This makes no sense with what I've done. I talked about making cheese. But for you, Lacey, you've studied Lindbergh and people who have similar beliefs to Lindbergh. You work in his childhood home. What is something from your study of Lindbergh that has affected the way you live everyday life? What is something that, even if it's like, I'm never going to put a baby in a closet, or some bigger expounding life, you've dedicated so much of your life to studying and learning and sharing the story. What is for you the biggest takeaway that is, I guess, almost like a nutshell that our patrons who are online with us tonight can take and share with somebody else?
That's a really tough question. It's with Lindbergh, it's, when I came into this role at this museum, I knew Lindbergh and I knew what he, the troubling legacy that he had left behind for us to tell his story. And I like to communicate it with our guests who come to the museum too, is that just not everything is as it seems. People will go through our museum and our exhibits and be like, well, none of this information is in the exhibits, because our exhibits are old and they're a little dated and they need some work. But it's really just telling that complete story that makes this job incredible. And I think bringing that into my life and into everything else is really, it's sparked a curiosity for everything. I can go into a museum now and, be like, this is a really cool museum dedicated to, who I thought was a good person or a cool person. And then you find out all these other things. So being critical and being open-minded this job has taught me a lot about that. And it's fascinating to go out into the real world and be critical of everything that I see.
No, I really, I think you've hit the nail right on the head with be open-minded, be critical. It's okay that somebody did something that maybe we're not thrilled with. Let's be open to talking about it. And just exploring that and coming to, I think that idea of, I almost want to say being civil with each other as we come together to learn, like this too, is so important, and that's something we can take away from someone like Charles Lindbergh. Like what an extra nice little thing he's done for us after death is invite us to look at the world more critically and open-mindedly, and to be able to explore ideas and see the forest for the trees. I really love that. And of course, because the whole point of this program series is for our guests to get to experience these wonderful museums that do all this wonderful work and research, can you give one last shout out pitch to where they could find your museum should they get in a car and want to drive for 6-7 hours?
Yeah, so we are located in central Minnesota. We are in Little Falls, which is a very quaint and small community, full of historic houses. Actually, we're one of like 3 historic homes here. And we partner with each other in the wintertime and do Christmas programming. So if you want to see some really festive programs during Christmas time, we do that. Like I said, if you jump up to Minneapolis, St. Paul area, we're about a 2.5-hour car drive from there. And we are open in the summers from Memorial Day to Labor Day, Fridays and Saturdays. But yeah, we'd love to have more visitors. We just celebrated our 50th birthday as a museum. And we're always excited to welcome new people and to get to talk about this stuff, because we're nerds. We like to talk about history stuff.
Wonderful. Well, Lacey, thank you so much for being with us tonight. And thank you guys at home for joining us this evening for our very first and hopefully first of many in our new program series, Night with the Museum. Don't forget, Night with the Museum is the 3rd Thursday of the month from 7 to 8. Next month's is going to be with the Mob Museum from Las Vegas. They're doing a program on the history of mobsters in Chicago. That's going to be on Lacey, you better sign up and go to it. It's going to be on February 20th, I believe is the 3rd Tuesday. And the speaker, that one I know the speaker for in advance, is Jeff Schumacher, who is their vice president of programs and exhibits at the museum. He's a wonderful guy. I can't wait to have him. And I hope you all go right now and sign up. It is live on the Schaumburg Library website. Until next time, everyone, please stay warm and safe. This is horrendous weather this January. And I look forward to seeing you guys at a future library